Hey everyone, welcome back to another chess video. In today's video, we're going to talk about a few types of pawn structures and why they are good and bad for your position. But first, what is a pawn structure? The term pawn structure just means where your pawns are compared to your other pawns. You can get different pawn structures by moving your pawns around, capturing pieces with your pawns, and losing your pawns. There's a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. Before we start though, I do just want to say that I'm coming out of a cold right now, so sorry if my voice sounds a little bit funny, nothing I can do about that. Anyways, before we cover specific pawn structures, let's take a moment to explore why good pawn structures are powerful. Let's take a look at this board where these pawns have good pawn structure. If we look at what is being defended by what, we can see that these pawns are all defending each other, and if one of the undefended pawns is threatened, it can potentially move up the board into a new square to be defended by the other pawns. This effectively makes a wall that your opponent has to get through. And what's good about this wall is that if we think back to our point values, pawns are only worth 1 point. So if your opponent can't break through with their pawns, they will have to trade a higher value piece for your pawns, which is good for us. Now that we know what a good pawn structure looks like, let's take a look at some more specific pawn structures, starting with the doubled pawn. Sometimes when you capture something with your pawn, you'll move that pawn on top of another pawn, and have two of them on the same file. Remember, file means the columns up and down the board. This is a pair of doubled pawns, and it's one of the most common pawn structures that you'll see. Unfortunately, doubled pawns aren't usually good for us, the reason being that neither pawn now has the ability to defend the pawn above or below it. Pawns capture diagonally, so what we want is for our pawns to be next to each other so they can defend each other, which is the opposite of what's happening here. Another weakness with doubled pawns is that the bottom pawn can't move now because it's stuck behind the top pawn. If the bottom pawn is attacked and you can't defend it, the pawn is simply lost, instead of having the option to run away. I've been talking about double pawns pretty negatively, but they do have one big strength that you can take advantage of. When your pawns double, one of the files on the board no longer has your pawn on it. What we can do here is to take advantage of this by putting our rook on the file we just opened up, and when we do, our rook can attack all the way into the other side of the board without ever leaving the safety of our side of the board. You can even double the firepower by putting both your rooks on the same file. In addition to doubled pawns, sometimes on rare occasions you'll end up with tripled pawns, which is when 3 of your pawns end up on the same file. I've even had games where I had 4 pawns on the same file. While doubled pawns are weak, they at least have some use, but tripled and quadrupled pawns are simply weak and don't really have anything good about them. They are extremely difficult to defend, none of them can really go anywhere, and they're too easy of a target for a rook especially to just go in and knock over the massive tower of pawns. You'll want to take special care to avoid getting tripled or quadrupled pawns in your games. Moving on from doubled, tripled, and quadrupled pawns, let's talk about isolated pawns. Isolated pawns are pawns that don't have any other pawns on the files beside them. This makes them very weak because they can no longer be defended by your other pawns. This makes it easy for isolated pawns to get stuck behind enemy pawns and get picked off. In most cases, you're going to want to get rid of isolated pawns as fast as possible, so that you don't end up losing material. However, just like doubled pawns, isolated pawns do provide one advantage, that being that your rooks can put themselves on either side of an isolated pawn and have a long range attack, the same as with doubled pawns. Speaking of doubled pawns can also be isolated, like in this position. We call these doubled isolated pawns, and they are strictly worse than regular doubled pawns, because they have even less protection than before. Try to get rid of doubled isolated pawns as soon as possible. So far, the pawn structures we've looked at have been things that are mostly independent of our opponent. If our opponent's pieces suddenly vanished from the board, we'd still have doubled and isolated pawns. However, there are some pawn structures that are caused by our opponent, the most important one being the backwards pawn. Backwards pawns are probably the worst pawn structure we'll talk about today, so pay attention and make sure to avoid getting into this type of position in your games. A backwards pawn is a pawn that can't advance because your opponent will just capture it, because it doesn't have any pawns next to it that are able to protect it if you want to try to trade pawns. In this position, our pawn on e4 is a backwards pawn. On its left, our d5 pawn is too far up the board and can't defend it if we try to push and play pawn e5. And on its right, there's no pawn on the f-file. This means the pawn can't really advance here, it's stuck. This not only creates an awkward position for us, but also gives black a really strong square on e5 here if they want to put, for example, a knight on the square, because we can't challenge that knight with our pawns and would have to at least trade for it. The best thing you can do with a backwards pawn is just try to get rid of it as fast as possible. It can't be supported by other pawns, but if you have other pieces you can use to trade it off, try to do that as fast as possible so that you don't have to deal with it. Alternatively, you could attempt to capture the opponent's pawn that is making your pawn backwards, since that also gets rid of the problem. The last pawn structure we'll talk about today is the Fen Ketto. This is a bit more advanced than the rest of them, so don't expect to see this for a while, but you should still know about the Fen Ketto, so if you play against one, you know how to take advantage of it. A Fen Ketto happens when the pawn on the B or G file, for both black and white, moves up one square so that the bishop can take its place. This forms a strong defensive structure that lets the bishop sit on the long diagonal, letting it attack all the way into the opponent's back rank from the safety of your camp. Fen Kettos are strong because of the bishops, so if your opponent decides to Fen Ketto, you can look to trade your bishop of the same color, or a different piece if possible, with your opponent's Fen Kettoed bishop. This not only gets rid of the opponent's strong attacker, but also creates a hole in your opponent's defense that you can exploit with a bishop, knight, or queen. Furthermore, Fen Kettos are often done to lead into a castle, so if you get rid of the bishop and can take advantage of the hole in the king's defense, you can have a strong attack on the enemy king. Usually in these lessons, I have some puzzle examples to let you check if you really understand what's going on, but in this case, there's really not a lot I can give puzzles for, and I don't want to spend 5 or 6 minutes on just identifying what type of pawn structure is which, because that's probably too easy. Because of that, I'm not going to do puzzles this video, but like always, I still want you to look out for these structures in your games so that you can get rid of your weaknesses and take advantage of your opponents. With that being said, that's it for today, and I'll see you in the next video.